To our webinar today. My name is Sheree Hirsch. I'm the Marketing Communications Manager at Arctic IT. And before I turn the presentation over to Phillip, Kimi, and Jon to introduce themselves, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. So this presentation will be recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording a day after it concludes. So we've scheduled this for about an hour, but definitely want to have time at the end for questions for you all. So if you do have a question, please put it in the chat panel. There is a chat and a questions panel, and I'll be monitoring that so I can facilitate those as they come in. There's also a couple handouts that you'll notice in the materials section of the GoToWebinar control panel. So please do make sure you download those as well before the webinar concludes to make sure you get a copy. Thank you for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Phillip Jackson.
Thank you, Sheree. Well, I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Phillip Jackson. I am the CIO here at Arctic IT. And I'm lucky enough to be accompanied by two really smart people in this space who do work in tribal related to technology in the legal space, Kimi and Jon. I've got to present with Kimi and Rez, so it's always good to be able to reconnect and do a presentation that's hopefully informative to you all today. So I oversee both the technology and the security at Arctic IT, and so I think we're going to have some interesting things to talk about today. So Kimi, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Phillip. So my name is Kimi Gordy, and I'm a partner with BakerHostetler. I specialize in working in the kind of unique intersection of privacy and cybersecurity and clients in Indian country. So how do we evaluate your biggest data problems, your cybersecurity challenges, and your privacy puzzles against the backdrop of tribal sovereignty, differing business ownership structures, and all the different types of data that you may have as a tribal government.
And I'm Jon Knight. I'm counsel here at BakerHostetler, and my practice dovetails really well with Kimi's, as I do a lot of the interfacing with the federal government on issues around data security and data management. So whether that's cyber investigations, where I've worked with Kimi with several tribal entities before, or things like our topic today, AI. How do you do that appropriately as a participant in the federal procurement space?
Awesome. Well, let's talk through the agenda a little bit today. Give you a heads up on what's going on. We'll start here in just a second with a live poll. We're going to talk with Kimi and Jon about, when you sign a government contract, you have to inherit those rules, and we'll talk through that a little bit. We're talking about what we're hearing across Indian country related to AI, like what are peers saying, what are other tribes asking us here at Arctic IT. We'll do a panel discussion around tribal control related to contracts and AI. There's a lot going on in this space, and we get questions every day about it. And then really some practical steps, like what can you do, what can you take away in the first 90 days as you start on this journey, or maybe you're partway through it and want to figure out where to take it from here, as well as maybe things you can take back to your counsel, and then finish up with some Q&A. So we're excited to get started. Let's start with a live poll. Sheree?
All right. So with that, we'll launch our very first live poll. Georgia, if you don't mind pulling that up for everybody. So what is the current status of your organization's AI governance program? These are totally anonymous to everybody else, but it's written and operational across our organization. It's drafted, but not yet operational. We haven't started building one yet, or maybe you don't know. Give it a little bit here for everybody to get their answers in.
I feel like we need that little Jeopardy music in the background where it's like, dee, dee,
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
I don't sing well, but you try. Maybe lots of people here that don't want to answer, and that's okay.
And in some ways, I love everybody who's answering I don't know, because I feel like that is so honest, right?
Mhm.
with where you are. And it's where I think a lot of companies are, but they're going to say that they're fully operational, but really, I don't know.
Right? Well, it's looking like most either haven't started yet or don't know, but there's also a couple that have written one, so that's good, and getting it drafted. So thank you
Yeah,
everyone for being willing to share that.
awesome. All right, so let's talk with Kimi and Jon a little bit about when you sign a government contract, you start to inherit those rules. And we see people asking these kinds of hard questions today. Can staff use Copilot? What about Claude, ChatGPT? What tools can they use with contract data? Should Counsel approve AI before it's rolled out? And then where does tribal sovereignty kind of meet federal contract law? Where do those two intersect? When should IT stop and bring in legal counsel? I think this is a really important one, and why I'm glad to have Kimi and Jon here today as it relates to that, because there's a lot of traps around that. And then what does a tribe do at ground zero? Like, how do you start with this? So these are some of the topics we're going to tackle today. And I love, this is just going to be kind of an informal where we panel discussion. And so not a whole lot of slides, but we're going to kind of have questions and then talk through those. So Kimi and Jon, like, what obligations come with federal and state contracts if a tribe is signing one of those to do work for them?
Yeah, I think the answer is generally a lot, right? These are not contracts that have no strings attached by any means. And I think that when we picture them, I always like to think of two buckets, right? We have the fact that we're a tribal government, tribally owned enterprise. And so we have our sovereignty, which is something that, congressional acts have to happen to take that away from us. It's not necessarily we put our data into a model. This sovereignty, how it's conferred, it comes down to Supreme Court litigation. It comes down to what our compacts say. But on the other side, we have the ticky-tacky things that are performance under a contract. And those are separate from our sovereignty bucket. So performance, compliance, oversight, that's going to be your day-to-day obligations. And that's really what you're going to be agreeing to. And tribal sovereignty doesn't necessarily allow a contractor to ignore your contractual obligations, but at the same time, accepting a federal award is not going to suddenly open the federal government to every data set you have, every system, necessarily open you to suit, things like that. I mean, we're looking at the ticky-tacky issues you need to do, right? That's audit rights, records retention, maybe safeguarding specific types of information, agency investigation cooperation. And depending on the type of contract you have, say it's a defense contract, you may have different obligations than if you are doing an 8A SBA. And you're also going to have some different sovereignty waivers potentially, depending on the type of contract. So there's some different language that's going to apply in the 8A context if you're not an Alaska Native corporation than would apply, say, in a regular defense contract. So the most important thing first is understand what you are legally signing up for to do. I know, my daughter started kindergarten this week and we got our handbook, which was like our contract. And I didn't realize that I was signing up for so much trouble with the car line. But if you have kids, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? And so I have to have this yellow sign when I pick her up. That's going to be a performance obligation under this, but it doesn't interfere with the fact that she's still my child and I am her parent. But to obtain her, I have to have the yellow sign. So if you kind of think about it in that way, that's how it works with your sovereignty. It doesn't take away your sovereign rights, but it does impose some things if you want to get this award. Jon, anything on your side of the house?
No, and I think it's a good analogy to use, because really a lot of these things that we're going to talk about today, how do I use AI responsibly? What does it look like to build a good governance program? These are things that there isn't some overarching law, at least in the US at this point, that is going to say you must do things this way. It most of the time is going to be a function of, have I entered into an agreement with some party? Maybe it's the government, maybe it's some other vendor or other partner that you had at the business level, but you are promising that you are going to treat data in a certain way because of the nature of a contract that you have entered into. And it's navigating those types of things and kind of what are the best practices that are going to apply across this space, regardless of whether you're working with, defense areas or other federal agencies or things like that. Kind of what are some of those common types of requirements that you're going to see flow out of these contracts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see people occasionally be like, I'll be like, well, what does your contract say? And they're like, well, I don't know. I haven't looked at it. Like, and you don't want to get in that space where you're way down the road and don't know what obligations you have, right? Like, you need to abstract that stuff like early on in the contract so everybody knows what the obligations are.
And it's good to understand how the contract is defining data. I think that is one of the most important things you can do, because that's going to help you understand, is data developed pursuant to the contract? Is it what happens with data that you did before you got the contract, or data that was independently funded? And how does that all intersect? Are you keeping it separate so that only the data that's defined by the contract is implicated in anything that they can request pursuant to the contract? So really understanding those terms and how you can understand them to maximize your protections can be very, very helpful.
Awesome. Let's talk about a hot topic that keeps coming up, and it's fits and starts, we know, and that's CMMC, right? So a lot has happened over the last few years related, and then even in the past few months. So let's talk about CMMC for a second.
I mean, this fits perfectly with what Kimi just said about you need to know your data, because CMMC is all about what data am I getting, what is the classification of it, and then what are the controls that I have to address that type of data. So whether it's FCI, that kind of baseline CMMC level 1 data, or are we talking, controlled unclassified information, which is, going to be your level 2 information or even higher, right? That data drives then the decisions of what cyber controls I need to have for any tool that is going to be touching this data, whether it's AI or not, right? So you first have to know your data, know what classification system you're going to need to fit within, and then you select your tooling based on that. And that's going to be everything from AI to your Microsoft Office suite and like all of those other pieces. That all matters, depending on what your data is, telling you basically need to do.
Yeah, and for those maybe who are just thinking about government contracting, maybe just a little bit of what is CMMC and how's it like affecting as it relates to government contract? Like, what does it mean really?
Yeah, I mean, I could bore everyone with a very long discussion of what is CMMC. It's had a very long history to get us to where we are, but essentially, it is a cybersecurity certification model that has been put out by the Department of Defense that is saying if you are going to receive certain types of information or under a contract, whether you're a prime contractor or if you are a sub of a sub, like it flows down very, very far in the contract chain. If you are going to receive this type of information, you must maintain certain levels of cybersecurity controls over that information. And then you need to have some sort of certification process that is going to verify that you actually are doing what you're promising in the contract. And so that level of what does that certification look like, that changes depending on the severity or the sensitivity of the type of data. And again, it's going to be explained in your contract. You have to have CMMC level 1 or CMMC level 2 with a self-certification. And there's a whole big other problem right now with certain parts of the program are on pause, and we don't need to get into that for today's discussion.
Right.
But it's essentially right now self-certifications and attestations, which do unfortunately open up the possibility of liability for enforcement by the government for false claims or other situations if you are inaccurate in what those attestations are, and if you've committed some problems there. So it is it's a growing area. It's an area that is still in flux, but it's essentially how am I managing my data, what controls apply, and how do I prove it?
Yeah. And so there's a lot happening in this space right now, but ultimately it's about those controls, and whatever we call it into the future, it's going to be super important, right? Okay, Kimmy, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but like we're sovereign, like, but we also signed a contract. Like, how does that come together, right? Like, I can't just
Yeah.
do whatever I want as a sovereign nation.
No, I think that is, it's a great question, and it's all about how you're going to segregate your data, and this would apply whether you are sovereign or not. So we'll just say, regular company enters into a government contract. They want to understand what of their data is going to be subject to that contract. You guys want to do the same thing. Now, where you do have some sovereign opportunities to further protect yourself is going to be looking at the dispute clauses. And while you may not be able to change much in the terms of the actual federal agreement, because much of that is already set out, if you are engaging vendors to help you perform. So say you are getting an enterprise license with an AI product, it's going to be looking at those terms and how those could impact waivers. And so I think that is where I would focus your energy. Is there any kind of secret arbitration provisions in there? Is there anything that talks about data owner or following the model? And I know we're going to get into this a little bit later when we talk about what you actually look for when you really want to enter into one of these contracts. But if we're looking at it from a federal law basis, right, we want to think about, are we waiving our immunity to be sued? And so we're going to look for a contractual duty, which would be like we have to provide specific records for audit versus the contractor consents to suit in federal court for all disputes, right? The first doesn't automatically create the second, but then we end up sometimes accidentally putting in something where we have a arbitration or waiver, or we're potentially letting our data go be used to be trained in your AI vendors model or tool set. And so we do see that sometimes when conducting contract reviews for clients where they don't realize how the data security obligations are flowing down. And so it's something to think about, that just because you have your data in the cloud or you have your data being put into a model, that does not mean you are losing your sovereignty that has been, come from a congressional act, but you want to make sure you're not accidentally waiving certain rights.
Yeah, awesome. Like you got to get that right up front, right? And so let's talk a little bit. John's put together a great set of slides here. We have a slide for each one of these, but John, you want to talk about the overview of this 6 pillars?
Yeah, I think the backdrop to this is, we've seen a lot of activity from this administration with executive orders around AI. And what's clear at this point is, that there is at least an encouragement of responsible AI adoption. You can get into the weeds about what that looks like and different types of models. And again, we don't need to go too deep in that today. But the government wants to encourage AI usage by contractors, but it needs to be done in a responsible fashion. And so these are some of the kind of the big pillars that are going to support a compliance architecture for AI use as you start working and using it in your government, in your government business. So let's look at this first pillar, right? So governance. This is essentially how are you going to understand and manage the use of AI within your organization. And that's going to be, there's no one size fits all approach to this, but it's all about how are we able to kind of define what is AI, how are we using it, what are going to be the approval pathways for new tools or new data, and how do we make sure that there's not abuse of the tools that's happening. So there's elements of this here, right? So whether that's some policies that maybe need to be written, maybe that's doing some risk scores and some analysis that's going to need to be, more on the technical side to really understand, how is the data being used. But you're building out this governance program and understanding how that fits in the overall risk for your organization. And then you layer onto that, what are the specific rules and cybersecurity controls that are going to be in place for a particular data set.
Yeah, this is a great step one, and you'll hear this kind of throughout the presentation. Like you really got to start with that policy. What about pillar 2?
Yeah, pillar two. So we've got security, and that's more Philip. That's his bailiwick. But really, how are we not just going to have a governance program, but then what are going to be the technical tools and controls that we have in place around our AI use cases, being able to track and know what data is going where. And that's much more, these technical things that also need to be in place. It's one thing if you have a piece of paper that says we're going to do X, but then if you don't have the controls in place that are going to back that up, that piece of paper kind of becomes a little worthless.
Yeah. And keep in mind, and you can if you're wanting to really leverage your sovereignty here, right, one of the operating controls that you can think about putting in there is your own tribal code that addresses data security and protection and how you classify your own information. And now we can't change certain definitions that are imposed by federal statute or contract, but for your tribal data and the data that you have and own that would not necessarily be considered government data, consider how you might want to classify that and create your own ordinance to further establish that this is governed by the tribe rather than XYZ, state law.
Yeah. And, it's part policy, and you can use a lot of technology to help with this, right? To help enforce your policy. So it's good stuff. What about pillar three?
Yeah. So transparency. This principle is basically the idea that as data moves through your use of AI, you're able to generally follow the progression of how the data is used. So it's knowing what data is being put in from the outset. Where did we get it? What models are being used? What is the output? How are we basically able to see this AI lifecycle from start to finish, and then know what decisions are being made about that data as it progresses through that lifecycle?
Yeah. And all of this just continues to build on each other, right? You got to have that policy so that people know, to raise their hand of what they're using. So you have that transparency. Pillar four.
And pillar four, really, again, it's kind of the output of the transparency side of things. You need to be able to validate and know, all right, this data, this thing that I'm getting at the end of the day from my AI tool, how accurate is it? And how much do I care if it's a little bit off? And that's where this idea of maybe there's different levels of scrutiny that are going to apply depending on the type of use case. So if I'm using an AI to generate a press release for me, and I'm going to have somebody take a quick once over on it, that's a pretty low risk usage of AI, right? That's going to be very different than if you're using it for financial modeling that is going to have results that are going back to the government or another third party, right? There's the level of scrutiny and assessment that needs to be done, that validation step, is going to need to be a lot stronger and more focused for those types of use cases. So understand validation has a rule, but it is a bit of a sliding scale in terms of how much validation is needed depending on the type of use case.
Yeah, and we always, when we're developing technology solutions, we call it human in the loop. Like, how much human in the loop do you need for this particular thing based on the risk associated with this?
And I would say we still need quite a bit of human in the loop.
Yes. I think we've all been all seen things where you're like, you just copied and pasted this straight out of AI, and there's a lot wrong with it. Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's talk about accountability.
Well, it's the human in the loop. You still, as the contractor, you are responsible for what the end result of what you are delivering to the government. And you are responsible for what happens to the data. If you have promised you're going to keep data in a certain way from a security control perspective, you're not going to be able to say, well, I didn't realize my AI was doing something that I didn't really understand. You're still responsible. So how do you build processes and programs and then teach your people? We can't get lazy. We need to make sure that we as the humans are able to stay accountable for the data. So the human reviews, that's critical, and there's certain areas where that is actually more required by law to have human review, particularly over things where it is going to impact the rights of individuals. But then ultimately, how are you also recording this? How are you going to have any escalation processes for decisions that are being made based on this process?
So I can't say AI made me do it or the dog ate my homework kind of thing, right? Like
That's right.
I'm responsible for it. All right. What about supply chain?
This one, and I'm sure you've seen this come across as well. This one is a big concern for government contractors, particularly if you are in the defense industry, but it does apply elsewhere. And it's this idea that who you use as your AI vendor or to supply your AI models may have implications of supply chain security. So there have been certain AI models and certain of the larger organizations that have had some friction with the federal government recently and been designated as certain types of risks to the government. And if you have built your entire technology stack to rely on a particular model that comes from one of these organizations that then the government says, you know what, you're not allowed to use that anymore to provide services to the government. We don't think it's safe. That becomes a problem for you of how do you re-architect, how do you redesign and immediately pivot while still able to deliver the service that you were trying to deliver to the government. So knowing your supply chain, knowing the compliance risks that can be at issue there, and being able to easily pivot and scale is going to be a critical skill in this area.
Yeah, I think this is where we see a lot of waiver issues sometimes happen, right? Because you have your model, you have your big contract, but they're using other vendors that they need. And that is going to say any data that goes to them now is going to be covered under this other, arbitration clause or something. So now data that flows through yours, you've checked the boxes for your direct vendor, but that back end vendor, you may have waived something there. So it's important to, when you're conducting your AI legal review, really understand the full breadth of everybody that's going to be touching the life cycle of that data so that you can push back on the provisions.
Yeah, and it changes week to week, it seems like. So it's something to pay attention to.
Yes.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we're hearing across Indian country. Like I have calls pretty much every other day related to AI. And so just kind of touch on a little bit of the technology thing. I think this is probably the number one question I get is like, we want to use AI, but we're scared. We already have staff using AI, but we have no governance back to that kind of policy things. And like, where do we start? So, I mean, it is a problem. It's not that your people are a problem, there's a gap. And one is 66% of people are using AI tools they thought they weren't, that wasn't allowed. In other words, they're like implicitly choosing to use a tool in your organization that they're not sure or thinks that it's not allowed. 88% of people have shared work info with public AI tools. And I will say on this one, like I've had 2 calls, today's only Tuesday. I have 2 calls this week where people have told me they're like, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I'm using my personal AI like for this work stuff. And I'm like, well, thank you for telling me, and like, let's work through that. Yeah. But I'm just telling you, like, this is happening in your organizations right now today. I have people, like I said, telling me this. And then, also concerning is you have people sharing financial or confidential documents that they shouldn't be with AI. Like maybe you haven't done the training or whatever, but these things are happening in your org. So if you go back to the question of like, we want to use AI, but we're scared, people are using AI in your org if you're not providing the proper direction to start.
And if you're finding this out now, like you've decided you're going to start using it and you find out you've got these problems, it doesn't mean all of a sudden you now have to go report a bunch of things and you're in trouble. I mean, I think one of the, things to keep in mind is a lot of the public tools do have mechanisms where you can request deletion. Many state laws require the ability to delete. There are certain steps you can take to help protect the tribe, depending on what data was entered there. One of my, favorite things to kind of discuss is if you just enter something into an AI model and then we're able to go and get some verification that it was deleted in some way, right? Did a person actually view it? Well, AI isn't a person, it's a computer. So there's a lot of wiggle room in there and how different laws are going to treat this and what it looks like. And so it's not that I would be afraid that you're going to uncover a bunch of non-compliance. It's more about learn about the use cases that are happening so that you can plan for them and around them and what you need to do to help safeguard.
Yeah, can we jump back to that last slide really quick? I want to ask Phillip a question here. That larger percentage, that 88% shared work info with public AI tools. So why is that a problem, right? That's a statement, but why is that a problem?
Yeah, great question. I would say most people are using personally some kind of free tool, and explicitly you are telling these companies that they can train on this information, and that is a huge problem. You have someone, maybe you as an organization haven't put together how you're going to approach AI, and someone is going to take the path of least resistance and say, this tool is going to help me do my job, so I'm going to just use this free one, and then end up with confidential information, things that shouldn't be shared, that ultimately become part of a trained model that could leak out otherwise. So it's a big problem, and it's happening in a lot of organizations. So thanks for that question, for sure. So let's talk about some of the starting points, right? I think we continue to hammer on the policy thing, start with the policy, and we'll talk a little bit later about that, but what tools are approved, tell people what they can do, not just what they can't do. That's really important as part of your policy. If you just have a bunch of no's, then they don't know what is allowed. And we've kind of hit a lot on the data, where is your data, and are there tools inside that? Kimi, I know you and I have talked about sometimes these vendors are putting in AI tools, and
and you may not know that it's actually using an AI tool. Exactly.
Yeah, so
everybody wants to say we are AI forward now.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. I was approving some time off, and it was do you want AI summary of why they're? No, I can read why they want.
No, I don't.
I don't. Thank you. But we're seeing those tools right now just being proliferated in all kinds of platforms, and then again, I would say approve some tools as you get this policy together, and you're hey, we've paid for this. We understand how this company uses this data, and here's the tool we would like you to use. Again, people are going to follow that path of least resistance. So if you've given them something, that meets their needs, they're not going to go seek something outside of that. They're going to use the one that you gave them. And then just, what we've talked about, maybe you don't have contracting experience and don't know where these landmines are, and that's where people like Kimi and Jon can kind of help you navigate that. Anything to add there? All right. So how do we evaluate which AI tools are acceptable in a federally funded environment? It kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Jon, right? This kind of moves day to day, and so what kinds of things should tribes be looking at as it relates to figure out what I can use and what I can't use?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, the big takeaway from today is going to be the language of your contract matters. And so that's kind of the first start. That's the starting point. What have I agreed to that I'm going to have either strictly around AI usage or around general information security controls that I'm going to have in place? And that has to then guide the decision of which tools are going to be acceptable. And then, there may be ones that you may be operating in a particular environment where you have to use only FedRAMP tools, or you have to use only, certain things in certain environments. So that is what guides that decision. And then that's the specific tool, right? And you find one that satisfies those contract requirements. Or if there are not any explicit contract requirements, am I at least having a tool that is generally fitting within my risk framework? Have I built out this governance structure to some extent? And how does it fit in that larger risk profile?
Yeah, we often counsel folks to put together an AI team, right? That's all the different constituents. So you've got somebody in the room hey, we can't use that on this, contract or whatever. Especially
and don't forget to include HR on those teams.
Yeah. I think all organizations could put together an AI team, and then again, that gives people a pathway to be hey, I want to use this tool. That happens a lot in our org. People hey, here's a tool I want to use, and then we can evaluate it through lots of different lenses, right? Kimmy, HR and legal, and everybody has a seat in the room. And I don't want to say no. I want to look at it and then figure out if it's right for our organization. And if it's not, explain to the user why they can't. All right. Next question. What needs to be true before staff start using AI in a contract sensitive setting? And I'd say we do a lot of enablement training for our folks. And you take that policy and for that organization and you apply it to a lens of training. We're going to show you how to use this in a responsible way. And if you're working on a contract, what is allowed and not allowed inside of that contract is really important. So breaking down those processes, figuring out what AI tools you're going to be using, and then helping equip and train those folks on how to use those tools, both responsibly, not just responsibly, but effectively, right? So a lot of times,
training on prompts. Do you think how to write a good prompt? I think is something that is critical. And it can also help you to delineate your universe of what the AI is going to pull from too. You're setting those parameters, you're teaching people about how to give specific instructions. You can do the prompt, and it also could help people just typing in iteration. I know when I first started using it, I just natural language just wrote, and I would get back nonsense, and I would get so frustrated. Now I'm actually sometimes using a co-pilot to say, help me draft a prompt to identify XYZ and search for something in my email or whatever. And that's helped it tremendously. And I think that is useful whether or not it's contract sensitive, but I think it's especially important when everybody's competing for financial resources too, and how much AI are you going to give people?
Yeah, it's important. Prompt and context engineering is super important. Next, let's kind of have a little panel discussion around this contract-driven world related to AI. So we have, how do we maintain control? So first is know your obligations. I think we've driven that point home pretty well today, right? You have to know what the contract is. And all of them are different, right? Depending on what, we work with lots of different agencies. So not, I'm just working with the federal government is not a way to approach this, because each agency is different. Know your data. Another kind of thing we've hit home on today is what data exists, where does it lie? Don't use it. Please do not use free tools. Please don't use free tools. Something that was interesting that came across my desk the other day was Grammarly, people wouldn't think is an AI tool, but it absolutely has become an AI tool, right? It will read your data. So know where your data is, know what tools people are using. Write a policy, start somewhere. We have a sample one. I'm sure Kimi and Jon can help draft policies for your org, but definitely start there and let people know what they can do, what they can't do, and how to bring forward new tools, because we all know this is changing all of the time. How do I bring forward a new tool to my company that might get approved that helps me do my job better? train in plain English. Like we talked a little bit about, prompting is really important. If you have a really bad prompt, you're going to have a really bad output. And so how do I teach my people how to prompt properly, how to give the LLM the right context so that I get an answer that's tailored for me. So help train, and again, under the lens of all this other stuff, like where's your data, what tools are allowed, how do I request a new tool? All of that is part of how you control this. And then build a roadmap. Like, where do you want to go? We've done a lot of roadmaps for folks, like starting at ground zero, and like, here's where you want to be in 2 years. Like, how do I build agentic AI, right? But you don't want to start with agentic AI. You need to start with a policy. So, like, what's this roadmap look like for you?
So Phil, what do you think? That's a great, how do you maintain control? But what do you do if you need to regain control? Which of those areas, right? So this is already running rampant in my organization. Where should I really start if I'm trying to rein this in or get my, how do I regain that control?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like, I mean, I think for me, I don't want to shame anybody now, right? Like, if I shame someone, they're probably not going to come forward. So I need to know what is all out there. Like, raise your hand. You have amnesty. Tell me what you're using right now today, so that I can start to have that map of, all right, we're using these tools. Let's start putting that together. Like, what data do we have? What are these vendors putting in AI? You have to have an inventory of what is out there right now today, and then shape it in the way with your policies. Look through these tools that are being used and figure out, are these going to be allowed with the contracts I have or not? And I need to go to this person and say, hey, you're breaking our contract, and we can't use that tool. So I think, like, just the first step, if it's out of control, is say, hey, raise your hand and tell us how you're using these tools, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like it's definitely you're building the airplane while you're flying it situation for most people as they are trying to figure out what to do with AI governance, because the odds are someone in the organization is already doing a lot of stuff with AI. And so that idea of being able to know your tools while at the same time building your centralized governance and intake and evaluation process so that you can better address future requests, it's a challenge, but it is something that can be done. And I think a lot of people, there's a risk of just throwing up your hands and saying, it's just too much. Can't figure this out. You can, though. It can be gotten back under control. And so don't let this be a downer of a presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it can be, and it can help your organization. Overall, on the other side, you're going to be better off for it. So let's talk about practical next steps. So here. So what do you do for the next 90 days? And one is, let's look at our contract obligations, right? What are our contract obligations that we have out there today? And along with that, like, what tools do we have out there that exist today? Because just like Jon said, I mean, I have conversations with orgs every week where people are raising their hand and sheepishly saying, yeah, I'm using this tool. Give people the space to be able to tell you that they're using this tool as you're looking at your contract obligations. Definitely, I mean, ask yourself, do I have an acceptable use policy for AI? And not do I just have it, but do my people know, like, what's in that acceptable use policy?
And make sure that the team members that are looking at this are not just the IT person who is controlling the settings for your AI license, right? We want to make sure you've got some legal input, some operational input, and then also the people who are doing the day-to-day jobs, because they actually may know more about the data you have than anybody else. And so having full buy-in is very, very helpful. And also, this is really time consuming. And so getting that buy-in to say, hey, we're doing this project, we're starting this, it's going to take some bandwidth, can be actually help take some stress off people. So
Yeah, great. And I think it was like what we talked about earlier. You need to have a lot of seats at the table, right, that are discussing these things, and not just, this isn't just an IT thing. It's your whole org needs to kind of be involved with what this looks like. And then I would say, you need to publish your policy, train your staff of what that policy looks like, develop some pilots of how you want to use it. It's fine if you're just starting out to use the in a paid environment. You can use, just the interface that exists with these tools today, but later you might want some more automated workflows and that kind of stuff, like prove it up in the tools that exist today before you try to build something that maybe AI is not really good at doing. What can we take back to Counsel? Let's talk a little bit about that. So this is very near and dear to you guys. Are when AI is involved, get legal, right? Like it's better to do that early on than realize you got a problem too late.
It is. The other thing I would add here is when AI is involved, get a translator, right? Because we want counsel so that they can effectively evaluate the risk to the tribe, what's in the best interest of their members, what's in the best interest of the economic enterprises, actually explain how models work. What is AI? Because I think there is everything is AI. There was an ad campaign that was done where they posted like fake tech company ads that use like amorphous, like the data is now eggplant productions, right? And people actually got super excited and visited the website because they thought it was a new product. But it was to really see if the mystery behind it was what was making people respond. I think there's so much mystery behind what AI is now that it can get lost. And so it's very helpful to explain what an agent is, what an LLM is, how does it work? Here's the one you have. What does it draw from? Because you can't just say, we want to do this one. We've reviewed the contract. We're moving into the future. So share, what does it mean? How does it work? Who gets to touch it? What does it touch?
Yeah, awesome. And then I think we, have talked about like collaborating, because you need that across departments, not just IT, but like all of the people, important stakeholders need to have a seat at this table so that you're collaborating, and that your counsel knows that it's not just an IT related thing. It's everyone. And then enablement, like I know we've talked a lot about risk today, but like using AI in the right way is a really powerful tool. Like, and so how do I enable like folks to use and do their best work? Like put a human in the loop with AI, and you're going to have good outputs. If you just do AI, you're going to have slop, as they call it, garbage, right? So enable your people to do their best work. Like, what's that plan look like? So I know we're getting close on time. Maybe we could talk a little bit. We're both our orgs are here to help you with various things. Sheree, I think you have a flyer in the chat that people can download that you'll also follow up with. And Arctic IT is also here to help you. So do we have some questions?
We do. First one is from Chrissy. I believe this will be for Kimi and Jon. So how do you search the contract for those keyword indicators to know what data we should protect versus what data should be shared?
So from a sovereignty perspective, I'm going to look at data ownership, and I'm going to look at indemnity, and I'm going to look at the different types of recourses under the contract. Jon, why don't you take it on what to look for generally in terms of data?
The contract with the government, or maybe the prime contractor who has the ultimate relationship with the government, there's some common clauses that you are going to be focused on. In the DoD world, your DFARS 7012 clause is a classic one. And a lot of these things you can actually use AI, ironically, to do a quick search of the contract to look for common clause numbers that the government would use that are going to set your cybersecurity controls and set those requirements. That's one direction of your contract review. then the other direction is going to be in your review of either your vendors and understanding what are they giving themselves the right to do with data that you use, that you put into their platforms as you do your work. And so that's a much more of a tricky thing to kind of know off the bat. Oh, you always should look for these terms or things, but it's what are they giving in terms of their ability as your vendor to reuse your data? Are they agreeing to security controls that prevent them from using data in AI systems? Are they giving themselves permission to use AI systems? And so you kind of have to do this bi-directional analysis of the contract terms. What am I responsible for to the government? But then also, what am I telling my vendors that they need to be responsible for to me?
Awesome.
Awesome. Thank you. And Georgia, if you want to pop up our closing poll while we round out the questions here, that would be fantastic. Christy also is asking, there is a button that does not allow your info to be learned from that you can click to ask it not to learn on your information, and how much protection does it actually give? Phillip,
you mean like in the free models?
I'm guessing that could be.
Depends on the tool for sure.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, it definitely depends on the tool. Like, and even some of the paid tools, you just need to make sure that you're explicitly opting out of that. But there's a saying in my world: if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. Which means that, like, with a free tool, since you are not paying, the data that you're giving it is what you're paying. And so those free tools almost always don't have a way to opt out because you're not paying for them. So just be aware. And like I said, we've seen even in some of the paid tools, you have to explicitly opt out. So just there's a lot of tools out there, and I think you just have to look in each one. And some of their AI will help you, like you can ask, like, how do I opt out of this stuff, which is kind of cool.
Oh, she did
Phillip,
clarify.
I literally was about to use that exact same quote of if you are, if it's free, you are the product. I've got teenage kids, and I'm trying to teach them that as they're learning to navigate this world too, right? You have to make informed decisions, but it is so true that if something is free, the odds are there is something that they are getting out of you that is what is the thing of value, and whether that's your data or other things about you and whatever. So love that quote.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Any other questions, Sheree?
I think that's all we had. So just thank you guys so much. I think this was a super informative presentation, and I really appreciate all your expertise. And thank you for your time today, everybody.
Thanks, Kimmy and Jon. It's always great.
Absolutely.
Everybody have a great day.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Thank you, everyone.